Hey gang, there's been some, requests lately where folks have just been asking what exactly this truck is and what mods are done to it, and I figure any opportunity I have to talk RCs, I'll go ahead and take, so I do kind of like a build biology video on the truck. In any case, the truck is based on a Kyosho Mad Crusher. There's a lot of mods. I'm going to try not to ramble and go into extreme detail on all the mods, so instead I'll actually include a link in the description to the build sheet. I maintain that build sheet actually for myself just because so much is modified, altered, and tinkered with on this truck. It all inevitably breaks or wears out, and it's hard to keep track and remember everything, so I keep that build sheet for my own reference, but it's also handy to share for cases like this. In any case, though, it's a Kyosho Mad Crusher, or based on one at least. The side plates are USA 1 side plates. They just have less cutouts than the Mad Crusher. It doesn't look quite as sexy, but it's a little bit more material and a little bit stronger. The chassis has a ton of cross bracing. The cross bracing is all 6061 aluminum. I think if I recall correctly, I have 12 5/16 6061 aluminum cross brace rods, and then I also have 5 additional chassis reinforcement plates that are 1/8 inch aluminum plate. So to quickly take a look at that, it's actually easier to see from the bottom. If we flip the truck over, we could see, here, let me put some light on this. You can see cross bracing rods here and here, back under the rear fuel cell. We'll get into the rear fuel cell momentarily. Up here, here. Then the 6061 plate integrating this cross bracing together all the way up to the front bumper, which also functions as the mount that the 2S LiPo receiver pack mounts to. I'll get to that momentarily as well. And then, yeah, there's also the plates here and here, and on the front shock mounts as well over here. Those are actually no longer needed with the roll cage. I had put them on and left them on, and there's no harm in leaving them there. I would only save a few ounces to take them off. Also with the chassis mods too, or some of the primary chassis mods, I do have the radio box raised about 12 millimeters just to help clearance the front axle housing and the steering linkage and everything like that. Speaking of axle housings, it's awkward doing this with one hand while holding the camera. It's got the hot racing aluminum axle housings front and rear. The gears are not stock. It's got 430 gear ratio in there. I think the stock is 410. And then also the diff gears, the actual bevel gears inside the differential. They're the upgrade kit for an HBI Savage. It's just a stronger steel. It's not that sintered, pressed together, crappy steel that you see in a lot of RCs, but actual real machine steel. So they're significantly tougher than the stock ones as well. The hot racing axle housings are really tough, but they do have one weak spot. The C-hubs here, where they mount, that actually slides on. Not quite an interference fit, but a relatively tight fit that overlaps about a centimeter, or just short of a centimeter. But if the upper and lower M3 screws that hold that in place come loose, it'll wobble and loosen up, and then you get one of those corner hits that wants to like rip a wheel off or turn it fully out. One of those, I call them corner jabbers. You get one of those hits, it could actually rip it off. So what I did to mod these after it happened to me the first time is I bought a new housing to replace the broken parts and have some extra spares. I drilled and tapped 2 additional M3 bolts in the front and rear of each one, so that way there would be 4. And then I added these 6061 aluminum plates on the top and the bottom holding it together. So far it's been bulletproof. It's ugly, but it's effective. Also, the 4-link and pan hard mounts, they are plastic. I have not found aluminum ones other than the aluminum ones that are integrated with some axle housings, which I don't like for other reasons with those housings. So what I did here is I actually made these aluminum braces here and here on all 4 corners that turn the axle housing side of the 4-link mounts into a double shear type of setup. So now when you get a nosedive or something like that, instead of all that pressure bending on that plastic tab and pushing on the M3 screw, it's going against a double shear setup, much stronger. Also inbound here too, I'm using M4 screws instead of M3s to keep them from bending and stripping threads and popping out. It's a heavy truck. Everything just takes a lot more stress and strain. For shocks, these are actually 130 millimeter OFNA big bore shocks from the rear of a buggy, but on all 4 corners. They're fully aluminum. I find them, I mean, they're longer than the stock shocks, so they have more travel, and I find them to be very tough, so they work out very well. The shocks too, I'm using a little trick I found a lot of people for bump stops. They use fuel tubing. It always breaks and rips for me, especially on this truck being so heavy. I'm using actual automotive vacuum hose from the auto parts store with washers stacked above it and below it. They look much more like real bump stops, and they're practically indestructible, but they still have enough squish to function properly as a bump stop. As seen here too, all the 4-link mounts, they're all custom made too. These are 6061 5/16 aluminum rod, the same ones that I'm using for the cross bracing, for the 4-link mounts and the panhard mounts. The upper panhard mounts are GTB Racing aluminum ones. These are really, really tough. In fact, I had such a hard side slap landing the other day, I sheared these 2 M4 bolts that hold this one in, but the actual panhard mount itself was completely fine. Also, it has Hot Racing 80mm limit straps. They look cool and realistic, but they are functional, and they're trimmed right where even at max articulation, the side that's down and fully extended out is going to catch on the limit strap before it fully extends the shock. What else is there? The engine is it's a Mac 28. This engine's still breaking in, so jury's still out on that, on how good this engine is compared to the Big Red, or the modded Big Red, I should say, that used to be in here. Big shoes to fill in that regard. I'm running a Dynamite Long Life or Max Life clutch, GTB Racing hardened steel 3-speed clutch bell, GTB Racing hardened steel 3-speed transmission. The whole transmission stack had the bushings replaced with bearings, and it's all shimmed, so that way there's no play or slop or anything like that in there. It also has the 4th dimension RC transmission case. I should say really transmission cover, because it's not integral for the transmission where it holds it together structurally, but it keeps dirt and junk and everything out of there, which is definitely helpful, because these trucks, the transmission wants to suck things in almost like a wood chipper, which is problematic considering that they're, off-road in rocks and dirt and sticks and all that good stuff. The air filter is Dynamite Big Block air filter, and it's got this outerwears pre-filter on it. I do like to run this truck in the mud and the rain and in the snow and everything like that, so it just helps keep the filter cleaner and drier longer. The exhaust is center mounted. I did that so that way the truck looks better, especially when the body's on it, just hiding the exhaust away. And then obviously also the exhaust being in there, it's well protected, so I don't have to worry about denting or damaging pipes when I crash or when people crash into me or anything like that. What else do we have here? The brakes on it, they are stock but doubled up. So instead of being single disc brakes, it's double disc brakes. A lot more braking power with that setup. And then also to that end, the servo's set up as well with different geometry, just where it gives more throw pulling on the brakes. In fact, even with these brakes, I think I have the endpoint at like 60 or 65%, and it'll lock up all 4 wheels on an instant, no problem whatsoever. If anything, they're overpowered in this setup. I had to play with the exponential on this, in fact, to make the brakes less sensitive. But I'd rather have more powerful brakes than I need and detune them than not have enough power in my brakes. The steering links as well, just like the 4-link bars, they're all custom made from 6061 aluminum rod. They are thinner rod. The steering links are actually all made out of 1/4-inch 6061 rod, as opposed to the 5/16 6061 rods. I'm also running aluminum rod ends on the housing parts of the steering links. The reason for that is when you land on a hard nosedive or on the tail hard, all the pressure is pushing forward and the servo saver's not really doing anything, and it wants to break the links. The aluminum ones are tougher. I'm typically not a huge fan of them though, because they get sloppy. A way that you're able to work around the slop with this truck is to do a washer stack above and below with M4 washers, and it keeps the that brass retainer tight in the bushing on the rod end so it doesn't get slop. And since everything articulates together, however the suspension or the axle moves, it's no problem, because these just need to be able to pivot. They don't need to be able to articulate. The steering linkage going to the servos, though, there I am still using plastic rod ends, but they're the RC four-wheel drive rod ends. These don't need to be as strong, because any impacts those are taking are going to be absorbed by the servo savers. So here I'd rather have something that's more precise with less slop, because steering slop is a huge pet peeve of mine. Also, of course, as seen, it does have independent rear steering with its own servo for the rear steer. I'll show how I have that set up with the remote and the electronics momentarily. For the roll cage, this is actually I'm trying to recall what it was. It was a roll cage that was made for a T-Max, but I had to cut it up and mod it and everything like that, where I had to move the C-pillar forward, relocate the cab, and move rods around and add rods into it to make it, one, mount to this chassis and also fit under my OBS body when I do decide to run a body. The wheels, they are J-Concept Tribute wheels and J-Concept Firestorm tires with the gold compound. They don't balloon. They are mounted with RC four-wheel drive 17mm hex adapters. Probably can't really see them too well, but there they are. For electronics, steering servo Savix 1230SG. I used to have all three servos as 1230SGs, but over the years they've died. The throttle brake servo is a Beitu 25kg servo with aluminum case, metal gears. It works fine and it's plenty fast. The rear steer servo is a Beitu 35kg. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. This servo is a little slow, but the torque is good and it's very tough, and I don't like the rear steer to be too fast. Even with this servo being on the slower side, I still run it around 90%, so that way when I'm hitting the rear steer, it's not really whipping the tires from end to end that quickly, but more controlled. The electronics too, they're all waterproofed. I waterproofed the radio boxes actually using this, where I pretty much line them with weather stripping and then set it up where the weather stripping is like a squish gasket at the top when you close the hinge. That said, I never bank on radio boxes being 100% watertight, like where you could throw it in a pool and forget about it and not worry. So I also waterproofed the receiver in there as well. The way I waterproof receivers is actually really simple. I split the little shell that the circuit board is in for the receiver. I coat the whole circuit board with dielectric grease, fill the shell up with dielectric grease, close it, watch it all kind of spooge out the sides in every opening, clean it up. And then I also have the receiver elevated in there by having a piece of this on the bottom of the receivers, just so that way it's not sitting on the bottom. So if there is water ingress one way or another, the receiver's not sitting in a pool of it, it's elevated. And then if all of that fails, the dielectric grease is functioning as a moisture barrier, keeping the receiver dry. So far that's worked really well for me. The fuel cell, this is actually a Nitro Stampede fuel cell, and I mounted it back here. That was really an aesthetic thing. Monster trucks have the fuel cell out back like that, so that's how I set this one up. The whole goal with this truck was really to make it where it functions like a basher, but looks and feels more scale, but has that basher toughness. The small fuel tank, it doesn't really bother me though, because I do like Monster Jam style bashing and mostly backyard bashing, so it's no big deal for me to top off every 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, the cage, I'm remembering now. It's a VG Racing T-Max cage. They don't make them anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, I had to relocate the cab to fit under the Chevy OBS body, shorten it down. I added in inner A pillars, and then these rods to fit the look. Had to relocate a bar back here to make it where the rear fuel cell could open. A few other mods and tweaks, adding in all these brackets to mount it. It's mounted in 6 places, 3 on each side, like this into the chassis. Then above each shock tower, and then also to the front bumper, which is also mounted to that aluminum brace I showed before. Battery is a 2S 5C LiPo 2400 mAh. Also have this audible thing. It shows the voltage of each cell and the overall voltage, and it'll beep relatively loud, even loud enough to hear over the engine, once it gets down to, I believe, 6.4 volts. What else is there that's worth mentioning here? Oh yeah, the electronics in the rear steer setup. So This radio is a FlySky GT3B. I have it modded with, I forgot what it's called, I'll include it in the build sheet. But there's a different firmware that you can mod these with. It takes a little doing, but once you do it, you could remap any button or switch or control to any channel button or switch or control. So I actually have what would be the channel 3 trim set up to control my rear steer. That's a self-centering 3-position switch. I put an M4 grub screw in there so it's easier to catch with my thumb, and that's how I control my rear steering. And then I could also, if I wanted to do proportional rear steering, I could use this upper button, and the longer you hold it, the longer it steers either way, but I always just use this. And then for the rear steer as well, I have this servo mounted to a plate under the chassis. If you're wondering why it's mounted to a plate and then the plate's mounted to the chassis instead of directly to the chassis, it comes loose from time to time, and it's a pain in the butt when you have to take the engine out to tighten the screws from the top. So with this plate, what I was able to accomplish is, yeah, there's a little bit of weight added, but one, it doesn't come loose because the top of the recessed screws is pressed against the bottom of the mid plate, so there's nowhere for them to walk loose. And two, if I do need to take it out or tighten it up or service it or anything like that, I could take the plate off and pull it off as one assembly without having to deal with taking the engine out and remeshing the gears. The stock servo saver, that's replaced with this aluminum idler, and then I'm running on-servo horn style servo savers. These are the ones that come with the 3 springs, but I actually have 4th springs added to them for tightness. It's a big heavy truck with a lot of wheel offset, so there's a lot of strain on the servo savers. I replaced this because the plastic ones were breaking all the time, and you know, since then they actually have, there are hop-up aluminum ones for the stock style servo saver, but this setup's been working great, and if it ain't broken, don't fix it. That's a story with a lot of the stuff on this truck. You know, I got this truck over 4 years ago, and back then there's really no aftermarket for these, so I created and made a lot of things, and since then there has been an aftermarket, and some of it I keep the homebrew stuff that I've made, and some of it, of course, I've upgraded and switched. You notice it still has the stock drive shafts, not the USA 1 ones or upgrade ones. I found every type of drive shaft I use, they still break. The difference is, instead of these costing a couple dollars and buying them by the dozen, they're expensive. I'm not going to spend 4 times the money for a drive shaft that's going to last 25% longer. So I just kind of treat them as disposable wear items. Trying to think if there's anything else that's really noteworthy here on this truck. I mean, obviously everything's modified, everything's tinkered with. Oh yeah, the brakes with that setup with the dual disc, they do like to rub a little bit as they're set up. So I set up this little spring here that just makes the brakes instantly release. It's really just a brake release spring. You know, just one of those things, the more linkage and the more stuff that you have with the dual disc brakes, the more it naturally wants to rub until you hit the gas. With this setup, the second I let off the brake, it's fully releasing the brake and the wheels free spin. This mount back here, this is not me trying to be cute with a ring or Fast and the Furious monster truck or anything like that. That's actually my GoPro mount. I have this hole here, so I put it in the waterproof case here, mounting forward, facing forwards, and it kind of gives like an in-car view. I mean, really, for the most part, that's most of the noteworthy stuff. Like I said, I'll include a link in the description with, you know, the full build sheet for the truck and pretty much everything that's modified and part numbers. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, or suggestions on how to do anything different or better, definitely drop it in the comments below. Hope you all have a great day.